Okay, today we need to go over a new chapter. It's chapter 16. It's called Input Markets. And when we are looking at inputs, we are looking at land, labor, and capital. And labor and capital are the two most important. Those are the two most important inputs and the ones that we'll spend most of the time talking about. The key concept here with um labor markets or input markets is this concept of derived demand, which means that the demand for any input is derived from the good or service it's used to produce. And so I have an example here. Therefore, if the demand for widgets increases, demand for widget makers, the labor, will increase, or the demand for paper, which is used in making widgets, would increase. And so if the demand for the good or service in question increases, the demand for the inputs that are used to make it will increase. And so the first input that we're going to look at is labor. And labor markets are either perfectly competitive or non-perfectly competitive. We're just going to look at perfectly competitive labor markets today. In the future, we'll go over non-perfectly competitive labor markets. So here they will have both a market graph and a firm graph. And the key concepts here are these concepts of marginal revenue product. This is the additional revenue that a firm obtains from one more unit of additional input. So mathematically, it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. However, in a perfectly competitive product market, and the key thing here is product market, not labor markets, product markets, where the price is constant regardless of how much you sell, you can calculate it by taking you can calculate the MRP by simply taking marginal product times price. So in a perfectly competitive product market where the price of the product is constant regardless of output, you can calculate it another way. It's marginal product times price. It wouldn't be that way in, say, a monopoly, monopolistic competition, or an oligopoly where the price changes with the level of output. There you would have to calculate it, change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. The other key concept here is marginal resource cost, or what they like to use on the AP exam is marginal factor costs. Resources, factors of production, inputs, those terms are all interchangeable. And the marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost is the additional cost of one more unit of input. So again, it's the change in total cost divided by the change in labor, and that is in perfectly competitive labor markets. All right, in those imperfectly competitive labor markets, the MRC is also equal to the wage rate. That isn't the case in non-competitive labor markets, but in perfectly competitive labor markets, MRC is equal to wage rate. So the key thing here is the profit maximizing point. How we're going to use labor, the profit maximizing use of labor, is where MRP is equal to MRC. So a firm will hire one more worker as long as the MRP is equal to or greater than the MRC, but never where MRC is greater than MRP. And so if I'm going to hire a worker, if I'm going to keep my gas station open, I have a convenience store with a gas station. If I'm going to keep it open between 12 and 6 a.m., I have to make sure that how much I'm going to pay in additional cost to be open is equal. The revenue I'm going to receive, the additional revenue is going to be equal to that cost. If not, it's not worth me staying open. If it's going to be equal to that or greater than, it is worth me staying open. And that's what that essentially means. So the demand for labor here is equal to the MRP. Let me clean up these things. So the demand for labor is equal to the MRP. The supply of labor is determined by the willingness of people to work at various wages, and it's equal to the MRC in a perfectly competitive labor market, since they are wage takers, just like perfectly competitive markets are price takers. These guys are wage takers. So what's going to lead to changes in supply and demand? And I go over graphing these. There's a lesson. Um, I forgot to put the link in here, but I will after I do this video, um, there's a link to me explaining the graphs. And so you want to click on those links. What's going to lead to changes in the demand or supply of labor? Well, there's two demand shifters: changes in productivity. If we can produce more using the same resources, that's what productivity is. If productivity increases, then the demand for labor increases. If productivity decreases, demand for labor decreases. And the other key thing is the change in the output product price. If we're making widgets and the price of widgets go up, that's going to lead to an increase in the demand for inputs for making widgets. So if there's an increase in the product price, demand will increase, because again, demand is equal to the MRP, the marginal revenue product. And that is our total revenue divided by the change, or change in total revenue divided by the change in labor, or marginal product times price. So if the price of the product increases, then the MRP increases. So demand increases. So those are the two things. There's only two things that change the demand: changes in productivity and changes in the price of the product. The supply shifters here are population changes. If population increases, supply increases. If population decreases, it decreases supply. The willingness to work longer hours, that will increase the supply of labor. Decreases in the willingness, decrease it. And then there's things like non-wage income, like your stock market portfolio values. If this non-wage income increases, you become richer in the stock market, you might be less desired to work more. So it could decrease the supply of labor. Meanwhile, if your portfolio crashes like it did for many people recently, they may want to work more. Or you might be thinking about retiring. And now that your stock market portfolio has crashed, you're going to have to work longer. So that can lead to changes in the supply of labor. And then the last one, it's amenities. Things such as, Google allows its workers to play ping pong and volleyball, and they actually pay for their lunches. Those are things called amenities. If those increase, supply increases. People want those things. If those decrease, supply decreases. And so those are the things that can shift. And so down here, I'm going to have a link once I update it, but you'll want to click on that link, and I will explain how you graph these labor markets. So that's Unit 1.